One of the things which your book raises as a central issue for further discussion is the way in which Girard has been received, especially in the theological world in this country. And you pinpoint some of the reactions there have been, which have not been, let's say, entirely sympathetic. Quite strong criticisms from some theological and theologico-philosophical backgrounds. And it would be really interesting to examine a bit further where that resistance comes from in the reception of Girard in theology and religious studies in this country.
Yes, if you don't mind that negative note to start with, but it does illustrate the idea of difficult beginnings, I think, which is at the centre of this chat. I think Cambridge, in a sense, is, what shall I say, the redoubt of the steepest and deepest resistance, in some sense, to Girard. I'm thinking almost immediately of John Milbank, who was once a member of the divinity faculty here, who wrote in 1994, I think, a highly critical article, Stories of Sacrifice, and I'm thinking too of the subsequent adoption by Sarah Coakley in her inaugural lecture here of a sharply Girardian stance, almost as a badge of belonging to that body. And she spent the first 15 minutes of her inaugural lecture denouncing René Girard. Simply put, she saw him as a trendy, third-rate Freudian who had never got hold of the idea of man in the image of God. He was what theologians couldn't and shouldn't be. So there was an immediate negative reaction, which was localized at that point in Cambridge, I think.
And where did that come from? What do you think were the main motivations? Let's start with John Milbank's essay, which is quite a strong critique, not a totally unsympathetic one, but it does raise a succession of really quite sharp critical points.
Certainly, yes. And the fact that he's a distinguished colleague in theology perhaps gives us a chance of understanding in some strategic depth his resistance. For me, the shape and structure of that article are very suggestive. It suggests squarely how René Girard, when he comes along to this country, because there's always a delay in translation and fashion and so on, it falls pretty well automatically into a mould of understanding which is pre-constituted by Milbank's analysis of the Cambridge ritualists. That's to say, the group of people who explored, who pioneered the foundations of the disciplines of sociology and social anthropology, and who were concentrated on ritual. And Milbank's article, his paper, 25 pages on them, and that's called The Quest for Sacrifice, and the second 10 pages is The Quest Renewed, René Girard. So there's a continuity which he establishes. By the way, it helps to know that this paper of Milbank's first appeared in Contagion, which was the journal of the Girardian organization, COVNR, so that it was a sort of red card to the champion of that organization, and then he republished it in Theology later.
Milbank, of course, goes back a bit further than just the Cambridge ritualists. He's talking about a tradition, especially in German biblical scholarship, and to some extent, the beginnings of anthropology. Theories about sacrifice, theories about primitive religion. In Wellhausen's case, applied to texts in Hebrew scripture, but all of them, in a sense, folding in to an argument which is about, you might say, ritual as an imperfect form of reasoning which gives way to something more.
Yes, and at that point, the reference to Auguste Comte is very significant, isn't it? As well as perhaps to Morse and Hubert, whom he also puts in the same envelope, yes. Really, as it were. So there is a suspicion of the abolition of transcendence in its true vertical form, isn't there, to the benefit of a horizontal form of transcendence, and hence a distorting influence on the concept and notion of sacrifice.
Quite so. I think what Milbank is most consistently hostile to is any sense that there is a scientific agenda pushing the theologian or pushing the analysis of theological and religious concepts. And because Girard makes quite a bit of the fact that the effect of the Christian gospel is to unmask the irrationality of a sacrificial economy, Milbank quite readily assumes, well, that must be a kind of scientific critique of the religious.
Yes, I think that...
You've described exactly where he's coming from, but I would contend that although there is certainly a family relationship between Girard and the Cambridge ritualists and their German and French philosophic antecedents, that he is in fact the one who got away. That he is the one who engaged with all these people and in fact brings them back within the horizon of Christian, Judeo-Christian revelation and tries to establish an anthropology of the cross. That's right at the heart of Girard's work. And I'm not sure that Milbank has even seen that, or if he has seen it, he's immediately dismissed it as suspicious and perilous, because if Christianity accepts back from science a foundation, faith will do. He says that very clearly. I could find the quote, but I won't look. That he does actually say, he dismisses that idea quite significantly.
Yes, and in the terms in which he sets it up, I think he's right. It's not as if we are looking to borrow a foundational argument to illustrate the nature of the gospel. But I suspect what he misses, though there are hints that he might see the point, what he misses there is the way in which, for Girard, the sheer historical specificity of the Judeo-Christian story, in other words, something that can't be predicted rationally, is the turning point. It's not
Yes, well, the
an
turning
idea.
point.
The pivotal point is exactly right, and the cross is the pivotal point for Girard. That hence the anthropology of the cross. But Girard is certainly not saying, not even in Things Hidden, and he's read it quickly, honestly, he read it quickly, that the theologian has nothing to add, that there is no theology of the cross that can meet and interact with Girard's anthropology. That's the missing thing. And I think, where does that come from? Well, it's the question which Milbank asks very sharply and significantly of the genetic and ontological status of sacrifice and notions of sacrifice. I mean, for Milbank, he sees Girard as putting violence as a primary motif and hence transforming all sacrifice into violent ritual blood sacrifice. To which, I understand where he's coming from, but he's not seeing the larger picture. The larger picture is escaping him, and he is therefore dressing up Girard in the clothes of Comte. He's confusing a methodological abstention from theism with a metaphysical assertion, which is in fact atheistic, ontologically speaking. I think that is what he's most missing, and clearly there's a good reason for that, which is not only that he has a preconceived model, it is that he doesn't know enough about Girard to interpret the co-resonance that there is between them. Let me think. Well, I wonder if I could quote to you something from my book. Would that be in order? Let's see if I can find it. This is a quotation which comes from Girard's very first work, Deceit, Desire and the Novel, written in 1959, published in English about 1964. So about 30 years before Milbank's critique comes along. And he's talking about Proust, and in particular about passion and the infinitism of passion as evidenced in the adoration of the narrator for the Petit Bande on the Normandy coast. And he talks here about deviated transcendence. Yes, this is Girard on deviated transcendence. He quotes the critic Louis Ferrero, first of all, and then glosses. Passion is the change of address of a force which Christianity has awoken and oriented towards God. He adds, the negation of God does not suppress that transcendence, but it causes it to deviate from the beyond to the this earthly. And he states further that as heaven becomes uninhabited, culturally speaking, the sacred flows back over the earth. Deviated transcendence is the caricature of vertical transcendence. Now, that's Girard, 1959, right? And that is one of the things that most motivates his own religious conversion, which subterraneously evolves and deepens throughout his career. And Milbank doesn't know enough about Girard. He's only read the first half of his work. So after 1994, he knows nothing. But that is the period of deepening revision and opening out, which we'll examine a little later.
So I think the difficult thing for some readers, obviously, is to understand that the notion of the ubiquitous, archaic, sacred is not the same as the transcendent.
Exactly. But Girard is the only one who makes that distinction really deeply and cogently and forces our noses right into it. I mean, see, there are two styles here. Milbank looks at the immense variety of ritual practices, and he wants to extract from that variety a logical, unified concept. That's what he'd like to do. That's what scholars do, not Girard. Girard, who's like Proust, and who's like Descartes in a way, yes, Descartes plus Proust. He wants something much more strategic, much more inside track. He says, if the cross is what Christians say it is, what then were the beginnings of Darwinian humanity? That's his, and that's why he's following a line. Now, of course, you're right, that there are many other meanings to the word sacrifice, many other practices. Why would there not be? Look at Darwinian nature, how teemingly diverse. Now look at culture. Do we think that the forms of culture are going to be less diverse? They're going to branch off and become varied and diverse? Good luck with finding the concept in that.
And I read Girard partly as offering a kind of phenomenology of transcendence misconceived or transcendence corrupted.
Deviated
transcendence.
Yeah.
And any Christian theology needs some theology of the deviation.
Yes.
So I think that there is a very distinct bit of theological agenda there, which does not, to my mind, undermine the explanatory and illuminative capacity of the mimetic model.
Yes.
It's as if, well, in theological terms, theologians quite often say that the doctrine of the fall, in effect, says, as soon as we could think, we thought wrong.
Yes.
And Girard is saying, as soon as we could imagine a cohesive, unifying transcendence, we imagined wrong.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, in my book, I look at Genesis as new light on that problem. But that doesn't eliminate the fact that in Darwinian terms, the first thing that comes along is the struggle for life and its brutality and its bloodiness. And I try to explain in the book how it is that what seems to be a grisly discovery, the tabloid headline style, people are going to be averse to that, they're going to turn away from that, is in fact actually a very logical, very subtle, very inventive, and perhaps correct version of how humanity emerged, which does not at least negate Genesis, because Genesis comes along later and corrects it. See, look, things hidden. See this theme of things hidden in Girard, in the Psalms, in the Gospels, and then in Girard. It's nothing to do with esotericism. It's the fact that what is first in the order of being is not necessarily first in the order of experience and discovery and experience-based knowledge.
And very interestingly, of course, he takes not only the phrase things hidden, but also the foundation of the world as a concept, saying we're not talking about the purposes of God in creation, we're talking about our founding events and founding cultures.
Yes, but I think that the one will tell you there will be an anthropological truth and there will be a theological truth. And the one should talk to the other because it opens up the way to the other. Now, I think that's where we're going.
I think so. I think, as I read Girard again, what I read in the same partly is, here is the world we have founded.
Yeah.
But the hidden fact is that this is not the sole possible world, nor the sole rational world, or however you want to put it. Therefore, there is a logos to be recovered beyond the logos we have constructed in the foundation of our world.
Yes.
That is how I read Girard also. Now, what more generally, let's talk about anthropology and theology, problems and opportunities of the dialogue between these two disciplines. What more generally, I wonder, are the problems and difficulties of reception? Does René Girard, for instance, have an ambiguous profile in some sense, inviting non-recognition, misconstrual, suspicion? Or is it the intermediary, the mediator role, precisely, between disciplines that is difficult, that raises a difficulty? And can we eliminate that theologically?
I think there's always an enormous suspicion, isn't there, of someone who sets up to mediate between orders of discourse. And I think Girard stands very much in the middle there, in the vulnerable position.
Yes.
And it's interesting to see some of the early critical comments from non-theologians in this country. Malcolm Bull wrote some interesting discussions of this, basically saying, yes, but this is all conceived on such a global scale that you can't imagine really having an intelligent discussion about it. It's beyond discussing. And at the same time saying, but there are bridges built here which nobody else builds.
Yes.
So he's very much doing it on the one hand, on the other, having said some rather annihilating things about Girard's method. He then sort of draws in his horns and says, yes, but actually, there's no way of not thinking about these things.
That is typical, that sort of oscillation, that sort of fierce resistance, and then you draw back, well, after all, I'm not so sure. Sarah Coakley has written a recent article, I believe, a little bit like that, though she takes her position largely now on the idea that Girard has revised himself. Yeah, but here we have the ambiguity of Girard, don't we? The piggy in the middle aspect. And scientists, pure scientists, are going to say, oh, well, he's an apologist sub rosa. You can't believe his science because, firstly, he's not a hands-on science. He's not a fieldwork anthropologist. He's a second order. Though, let it be said that somebody has to be a second order reader of fieldwork discovery. And Girard is rigorous and comprehensive, and he's run all the latest stuff. So the idea that he's lazy is inaccurate. That is absolutely false. But one can see how scientists would attack him on that quarter. But on the other hand, religious people will say exactly what Milbank is saying. We're receiving back from science things we already know. We don't need you to tell us that, and so on.
Yes, and I suppose also it's the question of this being a very unfamiliar register of discussion for a lot of English-speaking.
Absolutely, that's very true. Yes.
We talked about him earlier in terms of some of the early work on literary criticism, and there is something in a quite neutral sense, novelistic about his imagination, as there is about Freud.
Very much so. I compare him in the book to Descartes plus Freud. Descartes plus Proust. Better than Freud as far as Girard is concerned.
Yes.
Because he's got that sort of immense boldness of rational consequentiality that Descartes has got. He will draw consequences and consequences and consequences. And then, on the other hand, like Proust, he's a great architectural structuring of time and our experience in time and fitting it into patterns of demonstration. So I nearly did a PhD on that, by the way. So I do appreciate that sort of view and the intuitive flair of Proust and the minute attention to the things that we do not notice in our experience.
But I think if you're looking at the architecture of Girard, which to my mind is absolutely right, it does mean that to be marked by Girard doesn't mean you have to sign up to a whole list of conclusions.
No, that's also extremely true.
Looking at some of what he writes, for example, about the origins of death rituals, I think, well, that's fascinating, but I have no idea whether that's right or wrong. I can see how it comes in the story.
Yes, that is interesting. Yes, he says a lot of things about death rituals. He says that civilization is built on a tomb, for instance. The tomb is the first element of... so there you are, there's the negative element of human experience. L'homme sans Dieu, in Pascal's term, that is true. That's how culture comes to start. What I think you were touching on a moment ago was the difficulty of French theory for the British mind. We're empirical muddlers through. We mistrust the broad sweep of theory, don't we? And its pretensions, we want to debunk it more than follow it. But again, I would say that, and of course Girard is in that camp, he's a post-structuralist theorist, but he's not the same as the movement that dominates the last third of French thought in the 20th century, which is Derrida, which is Lacan, which is Foucault, and he invited all those guys to America at a conference in was it Buffalo? No, it was the other university in 1967 or 8, I think. And he said with a mischievous twinkle later in his career that he had brought the plague to America. So, very successfully. Yes, but there, I think that there's a recoil in the British reader. That's one of the things. And then you see his theory is, yes, vast, but it comes down to a cluster of 2 or 3 brilliant ideas, which can be articulated in many ways, which have various fields of application. There is the outline of a grand narrative, but certainly Girard isn't the articulator and theorist of that. And it is, moreover, shifting and collective as an enterprise now. And Girard consciously put himself at the center of a network of people whom he encouraged generously and who now follow on with that work. So where is he in all of that? It isn't a school with a defined doctrine. It is an heuristic. It's a method of discovery, and that gives people problems.
Heuristic is a really helpful word here, I think, because the notion, back to what I was saying about Malcolm Baldwin and others, the notion that this is an architectonic scheme within which you can do a lot of connecting you wouldn't be able to do anywhere else. People are always very grateful for that because they prefer to do some of the small-scale problem solving. But in fact, the notion of setting up, as you say, something on the way to being a grand narrative, which gives you the tools for diagnosis and connection along the way. We don't come at it easily in this country, as you say, and on top of that, insofar as continental thought impacts here, it is largely the radicalism of a post-structuralist phenomenology of power.
Yes.
But what's interesting about Girard, well, one of the things interesting about Girard is, of course, he does give you some tools for thinking through how thinking is thought.
Yes. Well, that's part of anthropology. It's part of anthropos,
exactly.
And he does. Yes.
So it's not
it's a sort of desire theory.
Yes. Exactly. You don't have to set Girard and Foucault or Lacan against each other, because there is an element of Girard which gives you a grammar for making sense of some of those thinkers too.
Yes, grammar is a good word. Yes.
And I think that also throws light on the problem which we touched on a bit, whether Girard is giving us an unduly negative reading of the history of the Anthropocene.
Yes.
It seems to me that what he's done is to identify a mechanism which is pervasive and almost omnicompetent in the shaping of culture. Not so as to say, so human desire and human motivation are fundamentally evil and negative, but so as to say, this is the risk that the moment of hominization runs.
Yes, this is the risk run by hominization. I think that's an admirable formula, that's right. Yes, again I think of Pascal, misère de l'homme sans Dieu, mais félicité de l'homme avec Dieu. But you see, once Girard, looking at human development in time, looking at the progress of revelation in the Old Testament, so on, and coming through the gospel to the cross, he's reached the central, it's a pivotal point, and that's where mimesis, negative mimesis, bad mimesis, rivalrous, conflictual mimesis, pivots precisely towards what is already a category of his thought, which is good mimesis, loving imitation, reciprocal, self-emptying
exchange.
I think there, the key phrase in the fourth gospel, I do what I see my Father do.
Exactly, yes. St. John, I think, is the most mimetic of theologians.
Yes, and I would love to read Girard on St. John at length, and of course he quotes but he could write a very remarkable commentary on the fourth gospel.
Yes.
Well, I remember being much inspired by William Temple's commentary on the fourth gospel. He talks a lot about that. Yes, so we are getting more theological, aren't we, here? So we should. What about the mediator role, the Piggy in the middle? Do we get any enlightenment, do you think, from Hebrews? Took on our flesh, our nature. Does that tell us something about anthropology in its relation to theology?
It tells us, as I understand the Epistle to the Hebrews, it tells us something like this, that there is no healing except from within of the human crisis, the human tangle, which means that transcendence has to be at work fully within the human, within the finite, not as an extra, but as an opening out to a depth of presence. I've been writing a bit in recent years about Christology as fundamentally the understanding that the divine and the human are not in competition. There is no contested space shared between the divine and the human.
But in order to communicate with the mimetic creature, God becomes man. The revelation passes through that hominization. And so when Simon Weil says Gospels, before becoming theology, that's to say a science of God, are anthropology.
Yes.
And I mean, what's interesting about Girard and his biblical commentaries is that he will show you the anthropological patterns, but that doesn't eliminate or displace the theological meaning. On the contrary, it calls to them, it calls them in, it makes you aware of what they are. That's I think, what Girard is doing.
That's right. If, as some people say, theology has to beware of giving answers to the questions that aren't there.
Yes, exactly.
Then to understand what the anthropological question is something of a starting point for theology.
Yes.
There seems to be some evidence that peace is breaking out between some theologians and Girard, as if there's a bit of a recognition that there are resources there, quite apart from the theologians like Ivan Chaga and James Allison, who really are developing Girardian styles of theology. More broadly, perhaps, slightly more receptive attitude with them.
Yes, there's a whole line of Catholic thinkers and theologians who've expounded Girard and explored his links with theology. I mean, Michael Kerwin, British Jesuit, as well as James Allison. Grant Kaplan in America has written now quite an important book, which Girard the Unlikely Apologist. Girard works in the domain of fundamental theology, which is to say making theology intelligible, accessible and persuasive to people who are outside the flock, the church, the age. Now that seems to me an extremely important idea, and it puts him really in the same league as, I don't know, C.S. Lewis or Chesterton, or maybe, well, of course, Pascal. I come back to Pascal. I'm not sure that Girard won't end up as a sort of 21st century anthropological Pascal, but of course Pascal was already into anthropology in his own way, was he not?
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it goes back to this question of what questions theology addresses. And unless I think theology has some sense of what it needs to talk about to look compelling to a wider intellectual world, which is not at all to say theology has to be scrambling after other disciplines. But unless there's some sense of why it might matter,
Yes.
then it's going to be the dialogue of the deaf. I think what Girard therefore does is to lay out a set of anthropological questions in the light of which it's possible to see why theology might matter.
Yes, absolutely. That is...
For an apologetic
Yes.
strategy, in the most constructive sense, you
Yes.
don't begin simply by marshalling arguments in an empty room.
No, exactly.
You ask, what do you need to open up about the human world
Brilliant,
in
yes.
such a way that theological responses, theological
Yes.
perspectives
Yes.
make sense? You say, so that's why it matters, that's why I believe this.
I recognise myself in those preoccupations, those concerns and those questions, yes. Yes, he's extraordinarily good at that. So there has been a development of his thought. Schwager is extremely important. We'll perhaps come to him more specifically in a minute. There's been more consolidation of what has actually been written and thought. There's been more methodic systematization of it. There have been colloquia. There are a number of books, like in France, there's been a book called Penser la foi chrétienne après René Girard. Now, there's an imposing claim there, isn't there, that Girard actually changes the perspective in which we see the whole of Christian thought and practice. And that's a very powerful book, which is actually quite very followed in France, but it's 20 years ahead of where we are in this country. We're really lagging behind.
Certainly so, yes. I haven't read the book, but I wonder how much it has to say about what Girard makes possible in thinking about the church, because some people have said, frankly, I said a few decades ago, there is just a touch in early to mid-Girard of what I call the liberal Protestant element of, say it and it changes.
Yes.
And what else is there to say about different kinds of...
This is one of his ambiguous profiles. Some people think of him as a traditionalist, who will support Benedict and Regensburg Address and so on and so forth, who, when he was converted, got remarried and had his children baptized in his Methodist wife and so on. So he has a sort of a traditionalist profile as well as a liberal Protestant open one. Part of his ambiguity. Church and sacraments, well, thanks to James Allison, I would say, who is the descendant, he inherits that particular mantle from Girard, and in Kaplan, he makes a very interesting case, actually, of the way the church should evolve in order to take account of Girardian insights. So he's creatively taking them and applying them. Now, of course, he's a pressure group for the moment within the church. But there are very central Catholic figures. I mean, Hans Urs von Balthasar is not a secondary theologian, is he? And he is reported by his biographer, anyway, to have said, Die Wahrheit, Girard's, can be integrated into a Christian theology of the cross. Now, he's got the point.
Yes.
And what an explosion that is. There you really begin to see theology from the point of view of anthropology, but by no means reducing it. On the contrary, opening it up and multiplying its accessibility and intelligibility.
Yes, that's right. Balthasar's actual discussion with Girard in Theological is an interesting example of a slightly double-edged response, but fundamentally, I'd say, positive. And at the end, what he says is, well, this is what's not there, but what we've got there is enough to be moving on with. But I think he's looking, as we've been saying earlier, he's looking for something more of a theology of the cross and therefore the resurrection.
Yes.
But I see no contradiction.
No.
But there is a very fruitful area of negotiation, of to and fro here. I mean, some of the Protestants have engaged with this very fruitfully, in my view. Why do they like Girard? Because Girard shows you the anthropological patterns in the gospel text, and he isolates what is really revelatory through them. I suppose it's like a chemical, it's boiling away the water in a way, and you see what the essence of the Spirit is. So they like him for that reason. I mean, he's sometimes compared, but the comparison made is the rediscovery of the Scriptures by the disciples on the Emmaus Road. When Jesus speaks and shows them the patterns. And I think that Girard has something of that quality about it.
I think so. I think that also illuminates the way in which he locates himself very much in that kind of rereading framework in respect to Jewish scripture.
Yeah.
He's very clear that he's not a supersessionist and anti-Semite, and I think that's absolutely right. He says, look, there's a thread here, there's a trajectory, which could not conceivably come to its climax in the life and death of Jesus were it not for the way in which this has worked through reading of the Jewish scriptures. And that's a really important part. I think, for me, part of his importance has been, for me as a theologian, has been looking at the way in which his structure illuminates the Trinitarian and Christological doctrines.
Right.
Because if you think of Christian theology of the Trinity as, among other things, a way of talking about real difference and real convergence, identity without absorption. If you think of the one will, this theology has it, of the persons of the Trinity. The one longing in the persons of the Trinity has played out in biblical terms in the fact that, to put it very simply, Jesus wants what the Father wants wants what Jesus wants, the Spirit wants what the Father wants, and so on. And that's laid out narratively in the story of the Gospels.
Yes.
And that's one bit of the jigsaw. The other is, as I mentioned a moment ago, the notion that when we talk about the divine and the human in Christ, we're not talking about two things that are in contest.
No.
We're talking about what it is that enables...
Not a tug of war across the line, no.
We're talking about what it is that enables this very specific historical humanity to be the bearer of a new, radically revolutionary desire in human beings, which is for the will of...
That is the point, isn't it? It's the conversion of the heart of desire. That's what it's about. And I would say that the anti-Girardian expulsion, if you like, but he was expelled really from the community of theologians and theologically minded thinkers, has really modulated and perhaps even converted into something much more positive. People who would have spoken like Milbank to start with, I know your thoughts enough to know that I don't like you kind of thing. It's a little bit like that. And I was saying, well, look, we have something to add. Theology has a voice to add. And what we add is the divine subjectivity. Now, precisely what you're talking about here, which makes your structures, anthropological structures, come alive. And in those terms, you can go right through the whole lot of Christian doctrine, from creation to Revelation to pneumatology, I mean, the whole lot. And what's Tom Wright working on? The Last Things. So, I mean, you can go through the whole set And Girard will actually help you. His concepts will help you. His way of thinking will help you. What he can show you in the scriptures will help you. So I would think that that is a very hopeful prospect for the future.
I think it's a deeply creative prospect. I think that if we want to present the Christian doctrinal vision in a way that is generally good news, generally transforming and converting news, we need to say this is what enables us to turn our understanding of human desire and human intentionality inside out. To deliver it from that imprisonment in destructive mimesis, to expose its murderous irrationality. Actually, no, we have a story, we have some.
René Girard himself thinks of that destructiveness as the shadow side of a potential that seeks its conversion to the good. That's why I wonder if his theory, which is in the end a theory of human relationalities, isn't the natural ally of Christian theology in the coming century.